The scent of roasted chicken, usually a comforting Sunday aroma in the Miller household, felt unusually heavy in the air, thick with an unspoken tension that clung to the dining room like a shroud. Emily had spent the better part of the afternoon working on the meal, a recipe passed down from her grandmother, one that typically filled their home with warmth and laughter. But today, the silence at the table was a stark contrast to the lively family dinners that had once been their tradition. David, her husband of 15 years, sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of weary indifference. He picked at the food on his plate, pushing a piece of carrot around with his fork as if it were a particularly difficult math problem he had no interest in solving. His shoulders were tense, hunched in the way they always were when he brought the stress of his work home with him, a fortress of quiet resentment that Emily found increasingly difficult to breach. Across from him, 10-year-old Sam sat small in his chair, his eyes darting between his mother's strained smile and his father's stony expression. He ate his food quietly, meticulously, as if trying to make himself invisible. He was a sensitive boy, attuned to the subtle shifts in the emotional climate of their home, and for weeks, the forecast had been storm clouds and a biting wind. Emily tried to cut through the quiet. "So, Sam," she began, her voice a little too bright, a little too cheerful. "You were telling me about the science project you have to do. The volcano, right? That sounds like fun." Sam offered a small, non-committal shrug. "It's okay." David let out a short, humorless laugh, finally looking up from his plate. "Fun? The kid's got a mountain of homework and they're making him build a volcano out of papier-mâché. What a waste of time. It's not like he's going to be a geologist." Emily's smile faltered. "It's a creative project, David. It's meant to make learning engaging." "It's meant to waste a weekend," he countered, his voice flat and dismissive. He then took a bite of the chicken, chewing it slowly, his jaw working. He swallowed, took a long sip of water, and then placed his fork and knife down on the plate with a clatter that made both Emily and Sam jump. He looked directly at Emily, his eyes cold and distant. "This food is awful," he said, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a still pond. "It's dry. The potatoes are bland. Did you even try to season this?" The cruelty of the statement, delivered so casually, so publicly in front of their son, sucked the air from Emily's lungs. It wasn't a criticism. It was an attack. Her face flushed, a familiar burn of shame and anger rising in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to say anything that would push back against the wave of his disdain. But before she could find her voice, another, much smaller one, cut through the suffocating tension. "Daddy," Sam said, his voice trembling but clear, "that's not how you talk to Mom." The silence that followed Sam's words was nothing like the one that had preceded them. The earlier quiet had been a heavy blanket of resentment, but this was a sharp, crystalline silence, fragile and fraught with peril. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to echo like a hammer blow. David's eyes, which had been fixed on Emily with such cold disdain, slowly swiveled to his son. The shift was glacial, deliberate, and all the more menacing for it. For a moment, David's expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken out of turn, but the shock quickly curdled, darkening into a thunderous rage that brewed just beneath the surface. His jaw tightened, and a muscle feathered in his cheek. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. She instinctively reached across the table, placing her hand over Sam's, a silent message of both protection and pride. "What?" David said, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all its earlier indifference and replaced with a chilling authority. "Did you just say to me?" Sam flinched at the tone but didn't look away. His small hand trembled under his mother's, but his gaze remained fixed on his father. He swallowed hard, his little chest rising and falling rapidly. "I said," he repeated, his voice smaller now but unwavering, "that you shouldn't talk to Mom like that. It's mean." The word mean hung in the air, a simple, childishly direct accusation that seemed to bypass all of David's adult complexities and strike at something raw and undeniable. It was the truth, stripped bare of excuses and rationalizations. For a heartbeat, Emily thought David might explode. She saw the fury flash in his eyes, the tightening of his fists on the table. But instead, he let out a sharp, incredulous breath, almost a scoff. He pushed his chair back violently, the legs scraping a harsh protest against the hardwood floor. "I've lost my appetite," he announced to the room, though his furious gaze was still locked on his son. He threw his napkin onto his half-eaten plate, a final gesture of contempt. Without another word, without even a glance at Emily, He turned and strode out of the dining room. A few moments later, the sound of the bedroom door slamming shut upstairs reverberated through the house, a definitive echoing punctuation mark on the ruined meal. Emily and Sam were left alone in the wreckage. The roasted chicken sat cooling on its platter. The potatoes, once a source of pride, now felt like a symbol of her failure. But as she looked at her son, whose eyes were wide and glistening with unshed tears, the shame she had felt moments before was replaced by a powerful, surging wave of love. He had been brave. In the face of his father's anger, he had been so incredibly brave. She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. He finally looked at her, his lower lip trembling. "Is he going to be mad forever?" "No, honey. He's just having a hard time." As she said the words, the same excuse she had been making for months, they tasted like ash in her mouth. It wasn't just a hard time. It was a transformation. A slow, corrosive change that was eating away at the man she had married. She remembered a younger David, one who would have praised her cooking, even if she'd accidentally burned water. A man whose laughter used to fill this very room. The pressure of his new promotion, the endless hours, the constant fear of failure. It had hollowed him out, leaving this angry, brittle stranger in his place. Tonight, something had cracked. Sam's simple, honest words had put a fissure in the foundation of their strained peace. As Emily began to clear the untouched plates, she knew this was more than just a spoiled dinner. It was a turning point, and she had no idea what lay on the other side. The task of clearing the table felt monumental. Each plate, heavy with uneaten food, was a testament to the evening's disaster. Emily moved with a heavy heart, scraping the remnants of the meal she had crafted with care into the trash bin. The bland potatoes, the dry chicken. His words echoed in her mind, each syllable a small, sharp jab. It wasn't about the food, she knew. It had never been about the food. It was the only way he knew how to express the bitterness that had taken root deep inside him. Sam, bless his heart, tried to help. He carried his own plate to the kitchen, his small face etched with a seriousness that didn't belong on a 10-year-old. "You can go watch some TV if you want, sweetie," Emily said, managing a weak smile. "I can handle this." He shook his head, his loyalty absolute. "I'll help you." They worked in a comfortable silence, the clinking of dishes and the running water of the sink filling the void left by David's angry departure. In their shared quiet task, Emily felt a renewed sense of partnership with her son. They were a team, navigating the fallout together. When the last dish was placed in the dishwasher, Emily dried her hands and knelt down in front of Sam, taking his small hands in hers. "What you did tonight was the bravest thing I have ever seen," she told him, her voice earnest and low. "You spoke the truth, and you stood up for what was right. I am so, so proud of you." Sam's eyes welled up again, but this time the tears spilled over, tracing clean paths down his cheeks. He leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. Emily held him tightly, rocking him gently, her own tears silently dampening his hair. She was proud, immensely so, but she was also heartbroken. Heartbroken that her son had been forced to be the brave one, that he had to stand up to his own father to defend her. A child shouldn't have to carry that weight. After a while, she led him upstairs to his room. She tucked him into bed, the familiar ritual a small island of normalcy in a sea of turmoil. She read him a chapter from his favorite adventure book, her voice soft and soothing, chasing away the shadows that lingered in the corners of his room. "Is Dad still mad?" he whispered when the story was done, his voice drowsy. "I don't know, honey," she answered truthfully. "But it's not your job to worry about that. It's my job. You just need to sleep and dream about building that volcano." He gave her a sleepy smile, his eyelids fluttering shut. "Okay, Mom." She watched him for a few moments, the steady rise and fall of his chest a balm to her frayed nerves. This was what mattered. This incredible, brave, loving boy. She would not let David's darkness dim his light. Stepping out of his room, she quietly closed the door, her resolve hardening. The hallway was quiet, and at the far end, the master bedroom door remained shut. It was a barrier, a declaration of war. In the past, she might have waited, given him space to cool off, and then tiptoed around the issue, pretending it hadn't happened for the sake of a fragile peace. They would fall back into their strained routine, the unspoken resentment simmering just below the surface, waiting for the next eruption. But not tonight. Tonight, Sam's words had changed the equation. "That's not how you talk to Mom." He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for David, but for her as well. She could no longer accept the disrespect. She could no longer make excuses for the man who was slowly chipping away at her spirit, and worse, modeling a toxic version of manhood for their son. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked down the hall. Her hand trembled as she reached for the cold brass knob of their bedroom door. She didn't know what she would say or what new battle awaited her on the other side. She only knew that the silence had to be broken once and for all. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a room steeped in shadow and silence. David was not pacing in a rage as she might have expected. He was sitting on the edge of their bed, his back to her, staring out the large window at the dark suburban street below. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows across the lawn, painting the room in muted shades of gray. His broad shoulders, which had been so tense and rigid at the dinner table, were now slumped, conveying a sense of profound defeat. He didn't turn as she entered. He simply said, "He hates me now, doesn't he?" His voice was hollow, stripped of the anger and authority it had held just an hour before. It was the voice of a man who had been confronted with a truth he could no longer ignore. Emily closed the door softly behind her, the quiet click sealing them in the space together. "No, David," she said, walking slowly towards him. "He doesn't hate you. He loves you. That's why what you did hurt him so much." He finally turned his head, and in the dim light she could see the anguish on his face. The mask of the angry, successful provider was gone. In his place was just David, her husband, looking lost and exhausted. I don't know what's wrong with me, Em," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The words they just came out. I heard them, and I couldn't stop them." "I know," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a deep, familiar ache. She sat down on the bed next to him, leaving a careful space between them. "But it's not just the words, David. It's the anger. It's been building for months. You bring it home from the office, and you unpack it on us. On me. And tonight, on Sam." He flinched, running a hand over his face. "This job, this promotion, it's not what I thought it would be. The pressure is suffocating. I'm in meetings all day with people who are just waiting for me to fail, to make a mistake. I feel like I'm drowning, and I come home, and I want peace. And when things aren't perfect, you think my cooking not being perfect is a valid reason to humiliate me in front of our son?" Emily's voice was quiet, but it was as sharp as glass. The softness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. David looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame so deep it was almost painful to witness. "No," he whispered. "No, of course not." When I saw the look on his face, it was like looking in a mirror. Not of me, but of my own father. Shouting, always angry about something small. I swore I would never be that man. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. This was the heart of it all, the ghost that had haunted their marriage for years. David's father had been a hard, critical man, and David had spent his life running from that legacy, only to find himself sprinting directly into its arms. "You're not him," Emily said firmly. "But you are on his path. You've been walking it for a while now. The difference is, you see it. Tonight, Sam showed you. He held up a mirror, and you didn't like the reflection." Tears welled in David's eyes. He didn't try to hide them. He let them fall, silent tracks of regret on a face worn down by stress and fear. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice a plea. "How do I fix this?" Emily reached across the space between them and finally took his hand. It was cold and clammy. "I don't know if fix is the right word," she said honestly. "This isn't a broken appliance, David. This is our family, our life. For starters, you're going to talk to your son. Not tonight, but tomorrow. You're going to apologize and you're going to tell him he was right to stand up to you." He nodded, squeezing her hand. "Okay. And then," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "you and I are going to get help. We'll find a therapist, someone for you to talk to about the pressure, about your father, someone for us to talk to so we can learn how to be a team again, because I can't do this anymore. I will not raise our son in a house where he's afraid of his own father and where his mother is treated with contempt. I love you, David, but I love our son and myself enough to not let that happen." It was an ultimatum, laid bare in the quiet intimacy of their bedroom. It was a line drawn not in anger, but in love and desperation. For a long moment, David was silent, the weight of her words settling over him. He looked at their joined hands, then back to her face, searching her eyes. He saw no anger there, only a sad, resolute strength. He had finally pushed her to the edge, and she was refusing to fall. Instead, she was offering him a lifeline. The silence that followed Emily's ultimatum was not empty. It was filled with the weight of 15 years of marriage. The good, the bad, the unspoken, and the long forgotten. David looked down at their intertwined hands, then back up at his wife's face. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it, a flicker of the same strength that had made him fall in love with her. She wasn't just his wife, she was his anchor, and he had been dragging them both into a storm. Finally, he nodded. A slow, deliberate movement. "Okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're right. You're right about all of it. I'll do it. I'll make the calls tomorrow. For me. For us." He took a shaky breath. "I don't want to be that man, Em. I'm just so tired of being angry." Emily's shoulders, which she hadn't realized were tensed up to her ears, finally relaxed. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but it was a tear of relief, not sorrow. She moved across the small space on the bed and wrapped her arms around him. David clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder much like their son had done hours earlier. It was a raw, broken embrace, but it was real. For the first time in months, they weren't adversaries separated by a wall of resentment, but two people finding their way back to each other in the dark. They didn't talk much more that night. The emotional toll of the evening had left them both drained. But as they lay in bed, the space between them no longer felt like a chasm. It was just space, quiet and peaceful. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. The usual chaotic rush of a Monday morning was replaced by a tentative, fragile atmosphere. When David came downstairs, dressed for work, Emily was already in the kitchen, packing Sam's lunch. Their eyes met over the counter, and a silent, nervous understanding passed between them. Sam was at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around in his bowl, his gaze fixed on the cartoon characters on the box. He glanced up when his father entered, his small face guarded, and then quickly looked down again. David's stride faltered. For a moment, he just stood in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, looking like a stranger in his own home. He looked at Emily, his eyes wide with a silent plea. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You can do this." He took a deep breath and walked over to the table, pulling out the chair next to his son. He placed his briefcase on the floor and sat down, not as the towering father figure, but just as a man. "Sam," he began, his voice a little hoarse. Sam didn't look up. "Sam, can you look at me, please?" Slowly, reluctantly, Sam lifted his head, his eyes wary. "I need to tell you something really important," David said, his voice soft. "What I did last night, the way I spoke to your mom, was wrong. It was more than wrong. It was mean, and it was disrespectful. There is no excuse for it. Ever." He paused, waiting for the words to sink in. Sam watched him, his expression unreadable. "Your mom worked so hard to make this house a wonderful home for us," David continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "And that dinner was her way of showing her love for us. And I threw it back in her face. That was a terrible thing to do." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table to bring himself closer to Sam's level. "And what you did, you were right. You were absolutely right to tell me to stop. It was brave, and it was loving. You were protecting your mom, and you were protecting our family. I am so sorry that I made you do that, and I am so proud of you." A tear slipped from David's eye. He didn't wipe it away. "Sometimes," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "dads get lost. We get stressed and we get angry about other things like work, and we forget how to be good dads and good husbands. I got lost, but you helped me find my way back a little. And I promise you I'm going to work really, really hard to not get lost like that again." Sam stared at his father, his young mind processing the raw honesty of the confession. He saw the tear on his dad's cheek. He saw the shame and the love and the sadness all mixed together. He finally broke his silence. "Are you going to keep being mean to Mom?" he asked, his voice small but direct. David shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "I am going to try my very best not to be, buddy. And I'm going to get some help, like when you have a coach for baseball to help you get better. I'm going to get a coach for my feelings." That seemed to make sense to Sam. He gave a small nod. Then he did something that surprised them both. He reached out his small hand and placed it on his father's arm. "Okay, Dad," he said. It was a simple gesture, but it was forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was a bridge being rebuilt. From her place by the counter, Emily watched the small, profound moment between her husband and son, her heart aching with a fragile, burgeoning hope. David's apology had been more than just words. It had been a dismantling of his pride, a raw and honest admission of his own brokenness. And Sam's simple, forgiving touch was a testament to the boundless grace of a child's heart. When David finally stood up, he looked at Emily, his eyes still red-rimmed, and the gulf that had existed between them for so long seemed to vanish. She gave him a true, genuine smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. That day, David kept his word. During his lunch break, he didn't just eat a sandwich at his desk while fielding emails. He researched therapists, making a call and scheduling his first appointment. It was a terrifying, humbling step, but as he hung up the phone, he felt a sliver of relief, as if a pressure valve had been slightly loosened. He called Emily to tell her, and the warmth in her voice was all the confirmation he needed. The weeks that followed were not a magical fix. Change was a slow, deliberate, and often clumsy process. There were days David came home from work, the stress of his job still clinging to him like a wet coat, and the old sharp tone would threaten to return. But now there was a crucial difference: awareness. He would catch himself, his jaw tightening, and consciously take a breath. He would look at Emily or Sam and see not the cause of his frustration, but the reason to fight it. He started talking. In his therapy sessions, he finally unpacked the years of resentment he held for his own father, and the crushing fear that he was doomed to repeat the same mistakes. With Emily, in the quiet hours after Sam was asleep, he learned to speak a new language, the language of vulnerability. He told her about the pressures at work, not as a justification for his anger, but as a shared burden. And she, in turn, felt the space to share her own fears, her own loneliness within their marriage. They were rebuilding their foundation, not on the shifting sands of assumption and resentment, but on the solid rock of communication. About 2 months after the disastrous Sunday dinner, another one was held. Once again, Emily roasted a chicken. A part of her felt a nervous flutter, a phantom echo of the past. But as the family gathered around the table, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The air was light, filled with the sound of Sam's excited chatter. And then, when I poured in the vinegar, the whole thing bubbled up, and red foam went everywhere, he exclaimed, his hands gesturing wildly. His papier-mâché volcano had been a massive success at the school science fair, earning him a blue ribbon. David was listening, truly listening. He wasn't looking at his phone or staring into the middle distance. His eyes were on his son, a look of genuine pride and amusement on his face. Everywhere? Did it get on Mrs. Davison? He asked with a playful grin. Almost, Sam giggled. She had to jump back. Emily watched them, her heart full. David caught her eye and gave her a warm, private smile. He cut a piece of the chicken, took a bite, and chewed thoughtfully. He swallowed, and for a split second Emily's breath caught in her throat. He said, his voice soft and sincere. This is delicious. It's perfect. The words were simple, but they were a world away from the ones that had shattered the silence 2 months prior. They weren't a hollow compliment. They were an acknowledgement, a small piece of a much larger apology that he was now living out every day. They were a promise. Emily's eyes welled with tears, but this time they were tears of pure joy. I'm glad you like it, she said, her voice steady. Sam looked between his parents, a happy, knowing smile spreading across his face. He saw his mom's happy tears and his dad's soft expression. The storm had passed. The house was no longer filled with a heavy, unspoken tension, but with the quiet, comforting hum of a family that had faced its own darkness and chosen the light. They had found their way back, not to the way things were, but to something new, something stronger and more honest, built on the courage of a 10-year-old boy who dared to speak the truth.